So for this first question, you're told that the minimum value is 4,000 in January. By July, the value goes up to 12,000. And by the following January, it's again back to 4,000. So we can see that this is a periodic function because it has a cycle that repeats every year, which just tells you the answer for the period, right? So the period is 12 months. If you said 1 year, that's correct, but it's not, because the units have to match the units of the input variable, which are measuring, they're measuring in months, because otherwise then like in July it's like a fraction of like the units are supposed to be months here. If it was years, July would be 7/12 for the input variable. That's a pain to work with and not what we're going to do. So the period is 12 months. The amplitude, this is the maximum output value minus the minimum, so it's half of the vertical height. So this is 12,000 minus 4,000 over 2, so 8,000 over 2, and this is 4,000 rabbits, because that's the unit of the output variable. And the midline, remember, you have to have y equals for this, so this is y max, it's the average, the midpoint. And this is 12,000 plus 4,000 over 2, so 16,000 over 2, so this is 8,000. So the midline here is y equals 8,000. Now, we have all this information. Now we can figure out what the formula is. So for this, we have a lot of information from part A, but what we haven't discussed is whether it's a sine or cosine function, and further, is it a positive or a negative value here. So to answer this, you need to look at where it begins. So it begins in January, and it's a minimum. So the minimum value is hit in January, and that's where we're starting the function from. So its vertical intercept is a minimum, which means that it's a negative cosine function. So we're looking for negative cosine, negative a, cosine bt plus c is the form for the function r of t. Again, it's cosine because the intercept is not on the midline, and namely it's a minimum, so it's a negative cosine function. If it started at the max, it would be a positive cosine, but here it's negative. And we know that a is, we just found this in part above, a is the amplitude, that's 4,000. C is the midline value, and that's 8,000. 8,000. And b is defined as 2 pi over the period, and the period is 12, so this is pi over 6. Great, so now the function is negative 4,000 cosine pi over 6 t plus 8,000. This is your function. And the graph of this I'll do below. I'm not going to do the second question because it's very similar. So the graph here, t versus r of t versus t. Your minimum value here is at 4,000. That's the intercept. So your function starts here and goes up and comes down, and then goes up and goes down. And we're doing 2 full cycles, so that's sufficient. The maximum value is at 12,000. That was given to you. The midline value here is at 8. And this first cycle is 12 months, and this is then 24 months. So that would be the approximate graph to some quality of this function. Okay, question 3, you're given the formula and you're asked to find the amplitude period and midline. So the amplitude, what you should not do is find the max and the min. This is unnecessary because you already basically have it, and then you don't have to plug in values and hope that you obtain the min and max. The better way to do this is to remember the formula that these functions are of the form a sine bt plus c, or b cosine, or a cosine bt plus c. So here, but these are the absolute values. So the amplitude is the absolute value of a. So absolute value negative 3.5. And this is 3.5. B is 2 pi over p, which means that p is 2 pi over b. And b is 1. I'm sorry, b is pi here. So its period is 2. So these are your answers, right? The amplitude is 3.5, the period is 2, and the midline value is the constant on the end, but it's 0. So y equals 0 is the midline. Okay. Second one, again, amplitude is the absolute value of a, which is the absolute value of negative 2, which is 2. So that's your answer there. B is 2 pi over p, which means that the period is 2 pi over the coefficient in the formula, which is 2 pi here, that's pi over 3. And this is the same as 2 pi over 1 times 3 over pi. And this is, the pi cancels out, so it's sits. So its period is sits. And lastly, the midline value it's this constant on the end of the shift. So the midline is y equals negative 1. The rest of these are very similar to that. Okay, so find the formula given its graph. So now we're going the other way. First step would be to determine which trig function this is. Is it sine, cosine, or negative sine, or negative cosine? You can see here that the intercept is on the midline, right? It's at the equilibrium value. So this means that this is a sine function. But is it positive or negative? Well, to answer that, you have to look at what the function does after it leaves the intercept. So it goes down after the intercept value, which means that this is a negative sine plot. That's the trig function that you would use. So the amplitude here is the max minus the min divided by 2. The maximum value is clearly sits, the minimum is 2, divided by 2, that's 2. Period. You would be looking at, you can look at this point at the intercept and then this point here. That's the same spot in the cycle, and the length between them is 30 pi. So the period is 30 times pi. And then the midline, so this is P. The midline is y equals the max plus the min divided by 2. The max is 6, the minimum is 2, divided by 2, you get 8 over 2, which is 4. And this is C. The other thing that we need here is the coefficient B, which is defined as 2 pi over the period, and the period is 30 pi. So pi cancels out and you're left with 1 over 15. So this means that y is negative, negative sine, and the amplitude is 2, so we have negative 2 times sine. B is 1 over 15 times t plus c, so plus 4. I'm not saying that the amplitude is negative here. I'm saying it's positive because the amplitude is always a positive number, but it's a negative here because we said that it's a negative sign. So make sure that when you write your formula, first of all, you don't say that the amplitude is negative because that's wrong, but second, that you include the negative because it has to be there. Otherwise, the graph is reflected. Okay, do the last one here. So for this one, which trig function is it? Well, the midline is here. It's the line the function is symmetric about, and the vertical intercept is on the midline, so it's a sine function. Is it positive or negative? Well, after the intercept, your function increases, so it is a positive sine function. The period is 18. This means that b is 2 pi over p, which is 2 pi over 18, and that's pi over 9. Yeah, there's a typo in the solutions here, but this should be pi over 9. The solution says pi 1 over 9, but it should be this. And then the amplitude here is, you can do the max minus the min, but it's this height, half of the vertical height here, so that is just 3. But you can use the formula as well, that's fine. And the midline, you can kind of see that it's at 0, but you could do the average of the two. 3 here plus negative 3 over 2 is 0, so the midline is in fact 0. So then your function here, we said it was a positive sine function. The amplitude is 3. So we have 3 sine b, which is pi over 9, times t, plus 0, because the midline value is 0. So this is 3 sine pi over 9 times t.